Welcome to the week number 11 overview for microeconomic principles here at Rutgers Camden. And in this chapter, this week we're looking at chapter 10, input demand, and we're taking a look at the labor and land markets. Make sure you realize that the same set of decisions that lies behind output supply curves also lies behind input demand curves. Just remember that this is just a slightly different perspective on the same problem. In the first section of the chapter, we look at input markets, the basic concepts. Remember that demand for inputs depends on the demand for the outputs that they produce. Input demand is thus a derived demand, and that productivity is a measure of the amount of output produced per unit of input. In general, firms will demand workers as long as the value of what those workers produce exceeds what they must be paid. Households will supply labor as long as the wage exceeds the value of leisure or the value that they derive from non-paid work. Inputs are at the same time complementary and substitutable. Make sure you remember this, that we talk about capital, labor, land, etc. They are complements, but also at the same time they can be substituted for one another. Realize that in the short run, some factors of production are fixed. This means that all firms encounter diminishing returns in the short run. Stated somewhat differently, diminishing returns means that all firms encounter declining marginal product in the short run. Also, the marginal revenue product, the MRP, of a variable input is the additional revenue a firm earns from the output produced by employing one additional unit of the input. MRP is equal to the input's marginal product times the price of output. Then we switch to take a look at labor markets and realize that the demand for input depends on the input's marginal revenue product. Profit maximizing perfectly competitive firms will buy an input, for example, labor, up to the point where the input's marginal revenue product equals its price. For a firm employing only one variable factor of production, the MRP curve is the firm's demand curve for that factor in the short run. Also, for a perfectly competitive firm employing one variable factor of production, labor, the condition W equals MRPL is exactly the same as the condition where price is equal to marginal cost. Firms weigh the value of outputs as reflected in output prices against the value of inputs reflected in marginal cost. Sorry about that, I just caught up with the points on the slide here. When a firm employs two variable factors of production, a change in factor price has both a factor substitution effect and an output effect. Make sure you can distinguish between those two. A wage increase may lead a firm to substitute capital for labor and thus cause the quantity demanded of labor to decline. This is the factor substitution effect of the wage increase. A wage can also increase costs, and higher costs may lead to lower output and less demand for all inputs, including labor. This is the output effect of the wage increase. The effect is the opposite for a wage decrease. We also take a look at land markets, and remember, because land is a strictly fixed supply, is strictly fixed in supply. Its price is demand determined. That is, its price is determined exclusively by what households and firms are willing to pay for it. The return to any factor of production in fixed supply is called a pure rent. Make sure you understand that concept. A firm will pay for and use land as long as the revenue earned from selling the product produced on that land is sufficient to cover the price of the land. The firm will use land up to the point where the MRPA is equal to the price of A, where air is land in the amount of acres. So then we go to the firm's profit maximizing condition in input markets. Every firm has an incentive to use variable inputs as long as the revenue generated by those inputs covers the cost of those inputs at the margin. Therefore, firms will employ each input up to the point that its price equals its marginal revenue product. This maximizing condition holds for all factors at all levels of output. And the final portion of the chapter talks about input demand curves. And a shift in a firm's demand curve for a factor of production can be influenced by the demand for the firm's product, the quantity of complementary and substitutable inputs, and the prices of other inputs. And remember also, changes in technology. From there, we switch to Chapter 11, which talks about input demand, but specifically looking at capital markets and the decision-making process for buying capital. The first section, we look at capital investment and depreciation. In market capitalist systems, the decision to put capital to use in a particular enterprise is made by private citizens putting their savings at risk in search of private gain. The set of institutions through which such transactions occur is called the capital market. So have a good understanding of what is meant by a capital market. Capital goods are those goods produced by the economic system that are used as inputs to produce other goods and services in the future. Capital goods thus yield valuable, productive services over time. So have a good understanding of what is meant by a capital good. The major categories of physical or tangible capital are non-residential structures, durable equipment, residential structures, and inventories. Social capital or infrastructure is capital that provides services to the public. Intangible capital, that is something that is non-material, includes human capital and goodwill. So make sure you understand the difference between those different types of capital. The most important dimension of capital is that it exists through time. Very important. Therefore, its value is only as great as the value of the services it will render over time. The most common measure of a firm's capital stock is the current market value placed on its plant, equipment, inventories, and intangible assets. However, in thinking of capital, it is important to focus on the actual capital stock instead of its simple monetary value. Very important. In economics, the term investment refers to the creation of new capital, not to the purchase of a share of stock or a bond. So make sure you remember that. Investment is a flow that increases the capital stock. Also realize that depreciation is a decline in an asset's economic value over time. A capital asset can depreciate because it wears out physically or it becomes obsolete. So make sure you understand what this notion of depreciation is. Then the chapter turns to the capital market. Remember that income that is earned on savings that have been put to use through financial capital markets is called capital income. The two most important forms of capital income are interest and dividends. Interest is the fee paid by a borrower to a lender. Interest rewards households for postponing gratification, and profit rewards entrepreneurs for innovation and risk-taking. In modern industrial societies, investment decisions, capital production decisions, are made primarily by firms. Households decide how much to save, and in the long run, saving limits the amount of investment that firms can undertake. The capital market exists to direct savings into profitable investment projects. Make sure you remember what the purpose of a capital market is. And the final section before the appendix is the demand for new capital and the investment decision. Before investing, investors must evaluate the expected flow of future productive services that investment project will yield. So they have to take a look at this over time and what it's going to bring in over time. The interest rate is the opportunity cost of investment. Make sure you realize that. This cost must be weighed against the stream of earnings that a project is expected to yield. Remember that a firm will decide whether to undertake an investment project by comparing cost with expected returns. The expected rate of return on an investment project depends on the price of the investment, the expected length of time the project provides additional cost savings or revenue, and the expected amount of revenue attributable each year to the project. The investment demand curve shows the demand for capital in the economy as a function of the market interest rate. Remember that only those investment projects that are expected to yield a rate of return higher than the market interest rate will be funded. Lower interest rates should stimulate investment. A perfectly competitive profit-maximizing firm will keep investing in new capital up to the point at which the expected rate of return is equal to the interest rate. This is equivalent to saying that the firm will continue investing up to the point where the marginal revenue product of capital is equal to the price of capital, or where the MRPK is equal to K, the price of K. Also, this chapter has an appendix on present value. Make sure you understand this. This is a very important concept to understand. It's used all the time in business, especially for projects that have costs or benefits that accrue over a time period. Remember that the present value of R dollars to be paid T years in the future is the amount you will need to pay today at current interest rates to ensure you end up with the R dollars T years from now. In this, it is the current market value of receiving R dollars in 10 years. Also, if the present value of the income stream associated with investment is less than the full cost of the investment project should not be undertaken. If the present value of the expected stream of income exceeds the cost of the investment necessary to undertake it, the investment should be undertaken. So make sure you're comfortable with that. That notion of present value is very important. So you should be comfortable enough to understand what it's meant, know the formula, how to use the formula associated with that, and how to use that to determine whether or not to engage in a particular investment.